Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. Do you remember when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990 and George W. Bush tried to sell the war to the American public with a story that before looting hospitals, Iraqi soldiers were taking babies out of incubators and leaving them to die on the floor? Do you remember that in December of 2023, a journalist reported from a children's hospital in northern Gaza that decomposing bodies of infants were found in incubators in the pediatric ICU? Two babies in incubator stories, one fabricated, one true. Let's discuss why this matters and why you should care. We are so glad to have you on our program again, Dan Kovalik, and you've been on a couple of times with us. And
yes.
And we'll chat about your new book. As for people that don't know you, you have a interesting background. You have been worked for the steel union as their primary representative. That's correct, for years and years?
Yes, I was in-house counsel for 26 years.
26 years. You're a professor. You are, I guess, kind of a human rights activist. Really fits you well, because you travel a lot supporting human rights. You've been to Ukraine. You just got back from Gaza, West Bank visit, and that's what we'll chat with you about your new book. But anyway, glad to have you. Glad to have you back.
Good to be with friends. Always good to see you.
And I noticed that you were on the Midwest Marks with Eddie. Eddie,
yes.
we had him on, and he said, "I'm doing a book on. I'm working on a long article on Venezuela." And I said, "Do you know Dan Kovalik?" "No, never heard of him." So I sent him off my copy of Venezuela, and he wrote back with great appreciation of how well that he enjoyed that book, and it helped him with his research. So
yeah, no, I appreciate it. No, and now he and I are good friends. So you were instrumental in that. So he's a good guy. I like Eddie.
Well, we're here to talk about your new book. It is A Case for Palestine: Why It Matters and Why You Should Care. Forward by George Galloway, which is no small thing. I love George Galloway.
I do too. George is the best.
And this is a timely book. Tell us a little bit about this, Dan.
Yeah, well, yes, I started writing it, I think, in November of last year, after the beginning of the most recent conflict between Israel and Gaza. And I went to the West Bank to do some research on it as well. As I mentioned in the book, it was actually some personal relationships that got me really interested in Palestine, including some students that I had at the University of Pittsburgh. There's several of those. One is a guy named Khalil al-Wazir, and he's named after his famous uncle, Khalil al-Wazir, who was the number 2 guy for Yasser Arafat.
Mm-hmm.
And Khalil is now, he lived in Gaza. He now lives in Cairo, Egypt, as a lot of Palestinians do. A lot of people left Gaza and went to Egypt. And I don't know if you know this, but in order to do that, you have to pay around anywhere from $500 to $6,500 per person, per adult. And I understand maybe $1,000 per child. And it all goes to one company that's run by the son of President Sisi. I mean, it is totally corrupt, totally horrible. What the Egyptian government is doing to and not for the people of Palestine. It's just awful. But in any case, those Palestinians really brought, I would say, just a deeper concern for Palestine. And so I wanted to do a book about it, and about give some history, of course, but really focus on the current genocide in Gaza, which that's what it is. And that's what I believe it is. And people need to understand that. So.
Right. One of the things that I found that I liked about your book is that how much you love the Palestinians. They're gracious, they're warm. You mentioned in your book they're actually one of the most literate and highly educated population, but I had no idea about that. And you have personal relationships with friends there that you care about, and they care about you. Tell us about the people, what you from your trip.
Yeah, yeah. Anyone will tell you Palestinians are some of the most hospitable people you're ever will meet. I mean, and especially given everything they've endured, they literally will give you the shirt off their back.
Mm-hmm.
When I went to the West Bank, I could not have done it. I went by myself, but I couldn't have done it without the Palestinians who helped me along the way. One of my students, and again, another student, her name's Yara, just a kind, sweet person. When she found out, I told her I'm coming. I'd like to see you. She insisted on renting a cab for me to pick me up from the border of Israel and Jordan. I went by land there across the bridge, King Hussein Bridge, and she ordered a cab for me to take me to Ramallah, and she took me out to dinner. And another Palestinian that I met in Syria and who introduced me to people in Lebanon as well. She hosted me, let me stay in a flat that she owned, made meals for me. Her and her husband would have me for dinner. Other Palestinians who I just met when I was there literally dropped everything for me. Literally. So I told my Amal, who was hosting me at her house, I said, I think I'll go to Jerusalem today. And she was like, okay, well, she called a friend in Jerusalem, Palestinian human rights activist. He dropped everything he was doing to give me a tour of Jerusalem, canceled meetings. He ended up driving me back to Ramallah, which I think took like 2 hours. And by the way, Ramallah and Jerusalem are like 8 miles from each other. That should be a 15-minute trip. It can take an hour. It can take 2 hours because of the crossings, the gates that Israel's set up that you have to cross. And every time a Palestinian crosses one of those checkpoints, I mean, they know they risk harassment, they risk arrest, they risk maybe being killed. It's really something. But as I said, Palestinians just went out of their way for me. Another woman who helped me there, and again, I didn't even meet her till I came there. Her name is Fadia, and she took me to her village outside of Ramallah, took me all around the villages there. She's like the queen of the village. She's from the Barghouti clan, which is very, very important, influential family in the West Bank. In fact, one of the Barghoutis is in jail now. He's considered to be really probably the heir to the throne of the Fatah party, the governing party of West Bank. And that's why he's in jail. The Israelis do not want him in power because he's not a sellout like the guy who's like a boss is.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, she again took me to all the villages, made me this incredible lunch. Everyone I go to, every Palestinian, the poorest Palestinian, they'd always have coffee for me, some candies. It's humbling. It's just amazing.
That really comes through. You how much they care about. They care for other people and aren't bitter. You said,
it's incredible. It's
I don't
incredible.
know.
I'd be bitter. I'm bitter as it is.
So anyway, Greg and I had on Norm Finkelstein,
No,
and
he's the man. He's the man.
he is the man. I mean,
Yeah, incredible guy, incredible intellectual.
Okay, so we had him on with his book. What was his book, Greg? Burn.
I'll burn the bridge when I get there. Yeah.
I'll burn the bridge when I get there. And just 2 weeks after we had him on, then this October thing happens with Gaza, and they didn't bring him on as an expert. I mean, it's just amazing how when that event occurred, how little accurate information was exchanged. And then he finally started to do the circuit and be listed as the expert. I think you've been on podcasts with him too. He's a remarkable fellow. But what I liked about your book, Dan, is that it's just such a good overview of the whole situation, the history of Zionism, the United States, how we sponsored Israel, the Christians in the Middle East, which I had no idea about. I learned a lot about that. Very approachable outline of what's going on. Maybe start with the short history of Zionism and how we started with this particular part of the world.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for your kind words about my book. I really appreciate it. Every author wants to hear that sort of thing. You can't. I can't be a judge of my own work.
It's
It's up
very
to
good.
you. It's up to you, the reader. So thank you. So it goes. Zionism in some ways is a new philosophy. It goes back to the end of the 19th century. And again, most people understand it as this philosophy, this desire of Jews to have a homeland, but not necessarily in historic Palestine. The first Zionists thought of Uganda is possibly a site for a Jewish homeland. And actually, there's an irony to that. I don't remember if I mentioned it in the book, but they ended up being dissuaded from that because the white colonial settlers in Uganda said, "Hey, there's no room for you guys. You'd have to displace us if you came. So go find somewhere else." And they were like, "Fine, okay, we respect that." So over time, they settled upon historic Palestine, which of course is also, it is important site as well. It's the Holy Land. It's an important site for Jewish people, for Christians, really for world culture is the truth of it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about, it's right next door to Egypt, of course. I mean, this is kind of the cradle of civilization, of all civilization. So it's a good zip code to have, whoever you are. And then, of course, it got real legs in 1917 when the British put forward this letter that said that Jews would have a homeland, a state in historic Palestine. Though it did say, it's very short, this letter, it did acknowledge the Palestinian people and said, that their rights should be preserved. It was, in a very abstract way. But that was the letter that got the ball rolling for Zionism in a very big way. And at that point, there were very few Jews living. There were Jews living in historic Palestine. There always have been. But at that moment, there weren't that many. It was a very small percentage of the population. But after that letter, Jews started moving there from Europe, particularly from Europe, in bigger numbers. But even by the time this state of Israel was founded, I think I mentioned only about a third of Palestine were Jews. And I think they only owned at that point a very small percentage, very tiny percentage of land.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, at the time Israel was created in 1948 by UN resolution, it was under British control. Around the same time as the letter I mentioned, the British and the Turks negotiated a land dispute from when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and Britain got the mandate to essentially govern at that time what was Palestine. I believe that was even done by Ataturk, the great Turkish revolutionary. I was just in Istanbul, by the way. You see his face everywhere. I mean, everywhere. It's amazing. I guess he's their George Washington, probably revered even more than George Washington. But in any case, And the British, under the mandate, began helping the Israelis start to prepare for the foundation of Israel. There's some very unseemly aspects to Zionism during World War II, where some Zionists collaborated with the Nazis to get their way to have a state in Palestine, supported some of the deportations in order to kind of drum up support for this creation of Israel. So finally, again, because of the Holocaust, I mean, it needs to be pointed out, Zionism predates the Holocaust, but it really was the Holocaust that spurs on the UN to say, okay, we're going to give Jews a homeland in Palestine. They're going to get roughly 50% of the land. Palestinians will keep 50% of the land, more or less, and Israel can have a state there. But that was, and the leaders of the new Israel, including the number one leader, David Ben-Gurion, they agreed to that, but they never intended to stop there with the 50-50 split. They immediately, when they began to conquer Palestine, and that's what they did, and they did so very violently, and of course I talk about that in the book, through the Nakba, they displaced 750,000 Palestinians, killed, I forget the number, but I think it was certainly in the hundreds, if not thousands of Palestinians, and did so through terror, and that was always the plan. They ended up taking a lot more of the land than the UN had offered them, essentially. And frankly, the UN was pretty horrified by what they saw. People like Albert Einstein were very horrified by what they saw. And immediately the UN tries to kind of not backtrack, but they realize this isn't working out for the Palestinians. So they pass resolutions. Oh, the Palestinians have a right of return. And they've reaffirmed that year after year. But the cat was out of the bag. And it was really too late at that point. While Palestinians to this day legally have a right of return, that's never been, there's never been an attempt to enforce that. And that's been a great shame in the United Nations, I think. You know, and again, one has to be sympathetic, you know, because of the Holocaust, you know, it's easy to understand why the UN did what it did. Even the Soviet Union supported the creation of Israel, you know, and I understood it for years. You know, and I actually took this out of the book. I was told to take it out. So can I tell you, I had a whole story about how when I was at the Steelworkers, everyone I worked with practically was a Zionist. You know, it was interesting. The Steelworker Legal Department was made up of two religions, either Jews or Catholics. Why that was, I don't know, but that's a fact. You know, Zionism was very, amongst the Jewish lawyers, was very important to most of them. And so for years, I was very sympathetic to Israel and Zionism. Again, mostly because of the Holocaust, but also because of my friends. So I get it. I get it. But the problem with it is that Zionism, and again, Albert Einstein and others saw this themselves, even though Einstein was originally himself sympathetic with Israel, that because it called for a Jewish-only state, and it called for the forcible settlement of the state by a minority people against a people that had lived there for centuries, it was always going to end the way it's ending now. It was always going to go this way, where a massive genocide is going to be carried out. So in 1948, there was this huge ethnic cleansing I mentioned called the Nakba. A lot of Palestinians were killed. Many more were displaced. But it stopped at a certain point. A lot of Palestinians still remained. Then in 1967, there was the Six-Day War, and Israel got more land and took more control and started occupying the West Bank, started occupying Gaza, but still the Palestinians remained. But the goal was always to get rid of every single one of them. And when you had the October 7th attacks, this was the pretext Netanyahu saw to do what the Zionists always wanted to do. And that was to get rid of the Palestinians. So they're doing that in Gaza. They're actively trying to do that. And they're doing that in the West Bank to a lesser extent. The West Bank isn't Gaza. That's going to be a harder thing to do because the Palestinians live amongst the Israelis there. You know, they're an intricate part of it. Yes, they're separated with walls and gates and expressways, but they're there and they're ensconced there. And that's going to be a brutal process. So basically, they've decided we're going to do Gaza first. We're going to start building more settlements in the West Bank, and they're doing that. We're going to displace more people, and they're doing that. We're going to imprison more people, kill more people in the West Bank, and they're doing that. But, you know, they're not going to go full on against the West Bank until they deal with Gaza, and that's what they're doing right now. So I guess that's the probably a longer explanation than you would have wanted, but that's kind of the history of how this all came to be. And I think it really, for many of us, the hateful nature of Zionism really didn't become so apparent till after October 7th. I mean, really, the mask came off.
Right.
You know, there used to be communist Zionists. There's still a few, but there's not many. Socialist Zionists, labor Zionists. It always had a socialist ethos, right? And especially on the kibbutzes. It always had at least this kind of veneer of decency and even leftism, but that's gone. It's over. Like
Totally
that.
gone.
It is now full-on fascism.
Yeah.
What we're seeing is some of the most despicable acts, at least that have ever been recorded on videotape, right? I mean, obviously terrible things have happened, but we're watching it in real time in a way we've never watched this sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that inspired a lot of us to do whatever we could, write a book, protest, whatever, because it's so awful. And the destruction in Gaza is so thorough. The destruction of mosques, every university has been destroyed. Again, you mentioned there's some of the most educated people in the world. So what do? They destroy all their universities, destroy schools,
Hospitals.
mosques, yeah, churches, hospitals. Unbelievable what's happening. And in very cruel ways, too. And there's a glee in it, the glee in the violence when you see these TikTok videos of Israeli soldiers riding around in tricycles of the families that they stole their houses and systematically. I saw one, and I don't know why it was more upsetting to me than others, but the one, an Israeli, you know, they take over this house and he starts to smash their china, one plate at a time, one cup at a time. And you just realize just the hatred that is being shown. Right. And I think that's the thing that I never got until now. That's what's painful. And honestly, I have myself have not seen that amongst the Palestinians. I don't see that kind of hatred go the other way. I'm sure there's Palestinians that harbor that kind of hatred, but I've never witnessed it.
Question for you, Greg. When this happened, the October 7th situation happened, were you aware that this was the final solution? I mean, that's what this is. You know, this is
it is the final. It has to be.
I don't know how else you can describe it, but I mean, were you aware, Greg, that this was, you know, like a major revolutionary, you know, event that was going to be wiping out all the Palestinians?
Dan spoke of an eventuality. I mean, there's an eventuality about these things. And so there are precedences for this. There's the refugee camps that were decimated or encouraged by the Israelis to be decimated. The slaughters that occurred what is it, Shatila? Is that one of them? I forget the
Shatila, yeah, in Lebanon. Yeah.
In Lebanon. And so there's a precedent for it. I mean, if you engage with the history of Israel, if you engage yourself with it, you see a process, dehumanization of even in the beginning, even when they were idealistic Israelis, they were left-wing Jews that were in positions of some influence. They would depict the Palestinians in a negative way to encourage this encroachment upon their land. They would say, well, our kibbutzes came here, we took land that Palestinians had, it was barren. Nobody could grow anything. They didn't do anything with it. It portrayed Palestinians as ignorant, backward, sort of Sephardic people that couldn't do anything. And look, we brought this all here and it flourished. So there was that racism in the beginning. And I'm not sure it was always deep or profound, but it was a tool of Israeli policies. And so, sure, over the years, we've seen this evolve and evolve, but we're letting, everything, I agree with everything that Dan said. I will only add that I think he's left the imperialist off the hook, because it's British imperialism that created this mess. Jewish nationalism was not anything new. The Zionist element of it and the extreme Zionist element of it, what we're exhibiting today, but they were allowed to begin to be nourished and to flourish by imperialism, by Britain in its time, and as the mandate, when they controlled the mandate, but probably more importantly in the 50s and 60s when the U.S. established Israel as its police person in the Middle East. If you include that, you can see that we've directed much of this. We've directed the foreign policy of Israel to some extent, and the domestic policy, because we've allowed it to happen. The aggressiveness, the taking over of land and so on. It suits the U.S. government's interest to allow that to happen. What is most striking today for me is that I hope the American people can see that this tail is wagging the dog. I mean, we were the people pushing this forward, and now Netanyahu's dug his heels in, and this is where we've gone with this. This is how ugly it's gotten. But we have to be careful. We have to be very careful, because even though I agree with Dan, there's very few remnants of the old leftism. The heroism of the Jewish peoples go back for centuries and centuries, and we must understand that. But this just shows that any people under the misguiding hand of extreme nationalism, theocracy, we must talk about theocracy. And if we talk about theocracy with Israel, we have to talk about in the other places in the Middle East where theocracy rules, to be very fair. And what that produces in the people and in terms of the way they view the world. So it's a very, very ugly situation. And it's so encouraging to see that people are stepping up finally in this country and saying time out and stop. And they're arrayed against powerful forces, in many ways, more powerful forces, more vocal forces, more extreme forces than we in the 60s were arrayed against in the anti-war movement. That's how ugly it is in terms of fighting this thing in our country, but we must fight it.
Yeah, and can I add to that a little bit? I mean, because I agree with you, Greg. And really, the last president who tried to put the brakes on Israel was John F. Kennedy. And the real patronage of Israel that we see today, I think, began with Lyndon Baines Johnson, because even Eisenhower was willing to put the brakes on them to some extent. And once Johnson, comes in, and by the way, and I don't know if you know, I just noted it in a line. The guy who founded my legal department of the Steelworkers, Arthur Goldberg, was Johnson's UN ambassador, and he played a key role in 1967 in giving Israel a lot of cover for what it was doing in 1967 with further annexations of Gaza and the West Bank. Just a funny, interesting connection there. But it was really Johnson that it was under Johnson that the U.S. took over from Britain and France as the real patron of Israel. And as Greg says, since that time, I mean, the U.S. has seen and used Israel as its beachhead in the Middle East. No question about that.
That's Stephen Gowan's book, Beachhead in the Middle East.
There you go.
And these are just exactly what Greg was saying. And what you're saying is that they've always been used by other people for, their purposes and our hegemony. So Go ahead. Sorry to
Britain is
interrupt.
really ugly in this. I hate to beat a horse. It's not a dead horse, unfortunately. I wish it were a dead horse. But the role of Britain in this is just ugly. They were
Yes.
promising things to the Arabs. They were promising, they had their nationalism as well. I mean, one has to understand there was a cauldron of nationalism, legitimate nationalism after, in the turn of the 20th century. People's homelands had been taken away from them by colonialism. And as people were fighting to get it back, and as some of the imperialists were loosening the reins or accepting the fact that they had to give these things up, they were slicing the world up in these ugly ways. Sykes-Picot, which cut up the rest of the Middle East, Iraq and Lebanon and so on. The French and the British did that. But they're the ugly people that enable this. They're the ugly people that chose out of Jewish nationalism. These are the people we're going to let being Jewish nationalism, the Zionists, the extreme Zionists. These are the people we're going to let be Arab nationalists, the monarchs. Those were the ones they pushed on that side. So their role in this, they sit back smugly and bemoan the fact that it's gotten so ugly. They created it. It's created by the West, created by colonialism, imperialism.
Yeah. And in fact, and of course, at the time the Balfour Agreement was signed, or the Balfour Declaration was written in 1917. Of course, very shortly before that, there was the Easter Uprising in Ireland, and which was put down by the British, and the British, of course, were carrying out its own oppression and occupation of the Irish peoples, right? And a lot of people make that connection that the British and the Americans, who themselves are settler colonialists, were happy to support settler colonialism in Israel. And it is a racist philosophy too. I mean, it has to be pointed out that European Jews, above all others, are given the number one priority in Israel over Arab Jews, over African Jews. And I mentioned how terribly African Jews are treated. Ethiopian Jews, for example, who were forcibly sterilized in Israel. They admitted that later. I mean, it's for white people, right? Under the guise of Jewishness, it is a white project.
Well, I would add the campaign in this country, which goes without commentary, goes without any kind of criticism, was Save Soviet Jewry, which was a dominant factor in this country for a long time. Well, the Soviet Jews, they were Ashkenazi Jews. That's who they wanted. At the same time, they were not letting Ethiopian Jews come into Israel. They didn't care about that. Again, it was a campaign. The Soviets did something interesting at that time. They made the mistake, as Dan said, of supporting the creation of Israel in the way it was, without guardrails and safeguards and all that stuff. It's important to remember that even the left in this country, Communist Party, Progressive Party, supported Israel. It was a number 2 or 3 item in foreign policy on the Progressive Party in 1948 was Israel, promote Israel. But when you go back and you see that this trajectory that Israel's taken, it could have been pushed in a different direction at any point. Should have been pushed in a different direction at different points. There were progressive Jewish people that supported Israel.
Yeah, no, a lot. And again, there's very few now. I mean, really, the progressives have largely left Israel, and they've ceded it to the right wing. And the right wing is in full control now.
Right.
And the Soviets distinguished Zionism from Jewish nationalism or from being Jewish. And that was a distinction that people are making today, but never made in the 60s and 70s when that campaign to save Soviet Jewry occurred. That was the distinction they drew. They drew distinction between those people that were radical Jewish nationalists and Soviet Jews.
Yeah. I just want to mention, I mentioned in the book, I mean, I met very brave Israelis, Jewish Israelis in the West Bank who defend Palestinian people. And those people have to be mentioned. Again, I think they're now fewer and far between than they used to be, but they exist and they deserve a lot of respect, and they pay a heavy, heavy price for that.
I remember Norm Finkelstein talking podcast a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about how proud he was to be a Jew growing up in Brooklyn he grew up in a working class area, and in his neighborhood, so many doctors and lawyers, and so proud of the small percentage of Jews in the United States with a large proportion of the Nobel Prize, and just this real um, feeling of warmth and affiliation with the Jewish people. And he said he's lost that. When you now look at soldiers shooting kids in the knees and making jokes and posting laughing stories about that, and the brutality. Who's better at destroying iniquities? The Taliban or Israel? I mean, that's hands down.
No, that's we care, but remember the Buddhist statue was destroyed by the Taliban, which was terrible, but everyone hit the panic button.
Hit the fan, yeah.
But you're talking multiples of that are happening just in the last few months.
Right. So I don't know if you've ever read the book Ordinary Men, the Police Reserve Battalion 101, The Final Solution. It was looking at the Polish, the Germans that were hired as policemen in Poland, that started off just policing and checking for papers. But by the end of the war, they were remarkably the worst, most brutal soldiers in the German army, killing just thousands and thousands of Jews in a systematic way. So there's something that rests within the soul, I guess, of all of us, that has this potential to be horrible and vindictive, and man, are you seeing that now with the stories that are going on with the bombing and the the rape and the just the brutality towards other people is extraordinary. I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah, no, it's in our reptilian brain or something. But yeah, I mean, especially the treatment of children. I mean, you just you see these beautiful children that are just being slaughtered, and maimed with just reckless abandon. It's just something. Well, and again, people say, you see this meme, and it's true. People wonder, what would you do if you were a German living during the Holocaust? Well, right now what you do, because you're doing it.
Yeah.
This is happening, and the U.S. is bankrolling the whole thing. So what are you doing right now?
Yeah, in my introduction, I mentioned the Iraqi war with the incubator story that turned out to be false. That that the Iraqi soldiers were taking babies and throwing them out of incubators on the floor. There's an article in December of 2023 about journalists coming to the hospital and finding all these incubators with decomposing babies in them.
Yeah,
that's a true story.
Of course,
that story is true. It's just like, oh my God!
It's unbelievable. No, it's unbelievable. This is a horror show. It's an absolute horror show.
All right, Greg. What were you going to say?
I was going to ask a question of Dan, but let me preface it with this. A lot of developments going on. I mean, one, the Israeli military assault, that aspect of it doesn't seem to be going well. I want to know if Dan agrees with that and if he thinks that's going to be really, really a problem for the Israelis. Two, it's clear they have a manpower issue, the Israelis. They're trying to recruit the ultra-Orthodox who are exempt from military conscription, and there's going to be a big fight back there. That's disrupting Israeli society from its usual day in and day out business. Three, you've got the hostages, which is creating a lot of turmoil among Israelis as well, who want to see that resolved. And four, you've got Hezbollah, which is a powerful, massively powerful force in the Middle East that people at their peril underestimate what they're capable of militarily, how well they're armed, and how principled they are in terms of fighting Israel. And five, we've got international pressure against Israel. So put all that together for me, if you will. Maybe you can give me some perspective on how you think things are going to go forward.
Yeah, well, I think as you're alluding to, I think Israel in the medium to long term will be gone. someone made a comment, and I don't know, we'd have to go through examples, and it's way beyond the scope of this discussion, but someone made a provocative claim, and that was, at least in the modern era, of course, because we'd have to accept the Americans, for example, but in the modern era, those who have attempted genocides are destroyed. They end up destroying themselves in a certain way, or they're destroyed by others. I think Israel's crossing this Rubicon into full-on genocide will destroy the project for the reasons you're saying. Because first of all, the world, and I don't care what I don't care what Biden says, I don't care what Sunak says. The people know, the people of the world know this is disgusting. This is horrifying. This is wrong. Israel has very few friends left in the world. Mm-hmm. And they know it. The Israelis know it. As you say, while they're very good at killing children, they have not made much of a dent into Hamas. And if they go after Hezbollah, which it looks like they're going to do, they will be militarily defeated by Hezbollah like they were in 2006. Their economy is in a shambles, an absolute shambles. But also existentially, I mean, they are in a crisis because the belief in Zionism was a belief in the moral supremacy of the Israelis. This was the most moral army in the world, they claimed, the best army in the world. It's neither the best nor the most moral. There was that SNL skit. I don't know if you remember that, but Mike Myers would be like, it's neither this, it's neither moral nor the best. Discuss amongst yourselves. They've realized this, right? I mean, it won't last. It won't survive this. It probably will for a while. It could as a matter of several years. But I believe the Zionist project is coming to an end. And they're doing it to themselves because of this cruelty. Because people, yes, they can be made to do bad things, but this will destroy them. And there are, the suicides are increasing in Israel amongst soldiers coming back from Gaza, amongst the regular population, because you can't do this stuff and not pay some price mentally for it. And so, and yeah, Israel's always had a population problem, right? They've always tried to get more people to move to Israel. And now what's happened is you've had at least 500,000 Israelis leave.
Oh, I didn't know.
Okay, that's 500,000 people who were productive in society gone. And they're not going to be reproduced by young Jews moving to Israel. Young Jews want nothing to do with this project, which by and large, young Jews find to be reprehensible. So they're not going to reproduce themselves. They are in deep, deep trouble, I think, in the medium to long term. But sadly, in the meantime, they may destroy Gaza. I mean, that's the sad thing. I mean, they may get away with this genocide to that extent, but they're not going to, the project won't survive this, I don't think.
Well, they just made the biggest seizure of land in the West Bank. What, yesterday? Did they, Israel announced
it? Yes. Yeah,
they're doing that.
Prepared to do it.
The other thing that I was told, I don't know if this is accurate or not, but we've dropped more bombs on this Gaza than just World War II and Vietnam combined. Is that correct? I mean, is that,
it's multiples of Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Yeah, because they're using 2,000-pound bombs. I mean, it's out, many of them, thousands of 2,000-pound bombs. Experts in the U.S., defense experts, say they wouldn't drop 500-pound bombs on an urban population like that. And they're dropping 2,000-pound bombs. This is insane.
So if you're looking at the bombs being dropped and just leveling, it's all rubble, you would think, well, just get a big bulldozer in there and take all the rubble and and put it somewhere and rebuild. But the ordinances will remain live and problematic for years and years and years. So they don't have the ability just to take a bulldozer in, because some of these ordinances don't explode. They'll explode. So it is a slow, laborious process to do the cleanup. So you've had, you're not going to be able to rebuild, just go in there and rebuild. It's going to take years and years to deal with the repercussions of the bombing.
I've seen estimates of 80 years. 30 years
really?
just to get rid of the rubble, 80 years to reconstruct. All the water supplies have been destroyed. They had great freshwater aquifers. Those are gone for the most part. No, they have leveled this place in a way. It compare. I think Dresden looked good compared to this. Grozny. I don't think we've ever seen anything on this level. I've even seen videos of trucks Israelis use to physically just tear up the road behind them. I mean, it is the most grotesque, methodical destruction of infrastructure, of civilian necessities that we've ever seen. It's really ghastly. There's, how Gaza comes back from this, I just don't know.
And we're being desensitized to it. That's part of the problem. We're being some of these stories aren't holding up very well. The stories of, but the tunnels. We don't care. We're not worried about the Palestinians. We just want Hamas. They raped all of the people at the rock concert. The beheaded babies. I mean, these stories aren't. They don't have legs. They're not working when you're seeing the level of response. And
well, yeah, but look, I mean, on the 24th, Netanyahu is coming here and he's going to speak before our Congress. He's been invited to speak before our Congress.
By both parties, yeah.
I mean, you talk about insensitivity. It's one thing for average person to be unengaged because they have the information in front of them, they're denied it by the media, whatever. But these are our leaders. They invite a war criminal to come and speak. Just incredible.
I'm just going to say it shows a real disconnect between the government and the people, because I think the people are not there. They're not where the government is on this. And again, it will lead. It's not just going to destroy Zionism. I think it will help bring the U.S. empire down with it. I mean, people are already questioning our own foundational history because of this.
Dan, I want to change the subject a little bit. The favorite chapter in your book is the United States, Israel, and the modern day persecution of the Christian church. I had no idea that that they're not only, I know they're persecuting the Palestinians, but the systematic assault on Christianity, the Christian church. First of all, there are a lot of Christian Palestinians. And you also mentioned this is for you, by the way, Dan. This is the Jesuit priests that were killed in El Salvador, the 6th Jesuit priest in El Salvador with the housekeeper's daughter.
Keeper and daughter, yes.
And all part of the liberation theology. And you mentioned that in Fort Benning, and how we literally trained these people who within 2 weeks went down and slaughtered all of the priests. 75,000 people killed in El Salvador, largely due to our support. So tell us a little bit about the Christian population and how you see their problems with this in this situation too.
Yeah, so there's a few things happening here at once. And so, first of all, yes, the Palestinians have always had a Christian, a sizable Christian base. Jesus himself was Palestinian, right? Of course, the Holy Family fled into Egypt as well, like Palestinians are now. I mean, this stuff, Greg won't want to hear this, I think, but it's very biblical in many ways.
Don't trigger Greg with
I don't want to
religion.
trigger Greg. No.
Yeah.
Hey,
So
I know more
Anyway,
about the Bible than you two do to put
no,
together.
okay. All right. Go ahead.
but in any case, and I quote this in the book, the Palestinians are known as the stones of the Christian faith because this is where Christianity began. I mean, when I was in the West Bank, of course, I saw the Mount of Olives, right, where Jesus had his agony in the garden before he was crucified, and Golgotha is there where he was crucified. I mean, everything happened there, right? In Bethlehem, I went to where he was born. I mean, so first of all, people have to wrap their heads around the fact that there was many Palestinian Christians, though not nearly as many as there used to be, because they have been methodically, ethnically cleansed and wiped out because they're an inconvenience to the Zionist project. Why? Because, of course, the U.S., while we have separation of church and state, it has always considered itself a Christian country, right? And that's been part and parcel of the American project. So it's not real convenient for the Israelis to be persecuting Palestinians when a lot of them are Christians. So they've tried to really wipe out all remnants of that. And that's happening in Gaza too. But there were probably, what I read is maybe 1,000 Palestinian Christians left in Gaza, because most have left because of the horrible conditions that Israel subjected the Palestinians to, and the Christians were able to find homes easier than the Muslims, is what it came down to in Europe and whatnot. But that was always part of the project, and it wasn't so much because they hated Christians, though I'm sure some Israelis do. And they, for example, I mentioned in the West Bank, it is a tradition, in fact, to spit at Christians as they walk down the street. But again, there's a political, or there's a practical reason to get rid of them. But the greater assault against liberation theology, for example, which began in the 60s, that was a project mostly of the United States, though Israel, again, was always happy to help the U.S. do whatever dirty deeds they wanted to carry out, wherever they wanted to carry them out. And I mentioned, so after Vatican II, in 1962, there was this burgeoning, movement in the Catholic Church of liberation theology, which was an attempt to go back to the early days of Christianity before it became the Church of the Holy Roman Empire, right? Before it became the imperial church, and to take a preferential treatment for the poor, and to not only give charity, which was always part of the Catholic Church, but to actually make social change, to overthrow repressive anti-worker governments. And many priests became guerrillas with the Marxists. And this really put the fear of God, so to speak, in the hearts of the ruling class in the United States. And under John F. Kennedy, and there's documents on this. They decided they would destroy liberation theology from its roots, because it was a threat to capitalism, and it was a threat to the imperial project of the United States, particularly in Latin America. And they did so through violence, as you mentioned, by killing priests, by killing archbishops. The Pope that we have now, Pope Francis, he knew 2 priests who were killed in Argentina during the dirty years, which the U.S. supported Argentina at that time. So did Israel, even though more Jews died proportionally in Argentina than any other group, because it was a neo-Nazi government, but Israel supported them to the hilt. So yeah, that's a very fascinating part of history. And the one big promoter of the idea that there was a concerted assault on liberation theology is Noam Chomsky. When I visited, I don't think I mentioned this in the book, when I visited Noam at MIT, he had 2 posters on his wall. One of Oscar Romero, and that poster behind you. Not quite as artistic, but the poster of those people.
Didn't he ask you if you knew what the poster was, or?
Yes, he said, this is a Rorschach test for you. He goes, I know a lot about you if you know who these people are. He says, if a Latin comes in, everyone will know, but many Americans, they won't know. But I did know, because I made it. The liberation theology is what brought me to leftism. I mean, I was a Roman Catholic, very devout Catholic, and it was the murder of Oscar Romero in 1980 that changed. Really, it didn't immediately. It wasn't a saw on the way to Damascus thing. It wasn't like lightning, but it planted the seed that made me a leftist. And I'm very grateful for that. And I'm, Hugo Chavez was a liberation theologian. He was very Christian, very devout, but also leftist. Danny Ortega is, I think, in that category. It's been a very important movement. And the U.S. saw it as important and wanted to wipe it out, and largely did. You'll see very few people even use that term anymore, liberation theology. So I thought that it was important to mention that because of the Israeli assault on Christianity as well. And again, I think the original idea of Christianity, which was small c communistic, is anathema to capitalism. That's the irony, because, of course, now many, modern day Christians view capitalism as somehow an integral part of Christianity. And I think, again, liberation theologians said, no, it's really not. It's antithetical to true Christianity. And so those ideas needed to be wiped out.
Yeah. So what struck me about your book that I learned is that we brought these guerrillas up to North Carolina, trained them, gave them weapons, gave them procedures. They went back to was it El Salvador
and Guatemala? Yeah.
And within 2 weeks, all these people were dead in the post. I mean, they, just like bang, dead. And they're also Jesuits. I too am a Catholic, somewhat fallen, very much fallen. But I have in my heart warmth and regard and respect for the Jesuits, basically because they kind of do their own thing. They don't necessarily listen to the Holy See. They've always been, independent in a way. And they were just doing the right thing. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's an incredible thing.
Let me ask the two of you this, because I come from ethnically Catholic. I mean, Lithuanian Italian, but I never was involved with the Catholic Church. What strikes me is, I mean, I've, out of pure non-sacred, supernatural reasons, I've studied Christianity. I've studied the birth of, and I find it very, very stimulating. The fact that the Jews are one of the first people in the Middle East to mount a nearly successful national liberation struggle against the Roman Empire. And the attack on Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem, is one of the landmarks in that history of anti-imperialism, of national liberation, where they all died. And they eventually wiped out all the Jewish fighters. And the Christian doctrine, when you study it, of course, is socialism or communism. It is. We don't have to put quotation marks around it. That's what it is. And so this is a legacy. How come organized religion fights so hard to restrain this tradition, to hide this tradition, to keep it from people?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think because, first of all, again, it became the official church of the Roman Empire. And it enriched itself as part of that. It became the opposite. I guess that's dialectics. I don't know. Became the opposite of what it began to be. It became a church of the aristocracy, and priests and bishops and the Pope enriched themselves and became very well off. And so the philosophy, the original philosophy, actually became anathema to them.
Well, even the Roman Church, when the Romans accepted and embraced with Augustus, they embraced the Catholic Church, there were people like Pelagius and others who continued the tradition of impoverishment, of the rich giving their wealth to the poor, and so on. That continued under the Roman Empire. There were vast estates that were, well, we're Christians, so we're going to give all this wealth up to the poor. but then it was squelched later on, by the church. What's the motive force? I mean, what drove the church to do this,
I
to
think
walk away from the tradition?
the will to power,
Power
that they
and power and money.
and wealth. Now the Catholic Church, I think, is the biggest landholder in the world. Maybe I don't know. It competes with McDonald's for that, but it's and the incredible wealth that it holds, and there's all sorts of intrigue. We know about it. The Vatican over money. They think that Pope John Paul I was murdered within the Vatican because he wanted to refinance Vatican or reform Vatican finances. I mean, there's real money involved here and real power that I do think they found these more communistic Christians as threatening to that.
Yeah, and we've seen schisms in the church for 2,000 years, both from the Catholic Church and within the Protestant churches as well, but they never seem to arrive at this. They never seem to arrive at revitalizing, outside of liberation theology, they never seem to revitalizing the church's actual history and traditions. It's a puzzle to me.
I think too, in part, Greg, I mean, I'm just thinking out loud. I mean, this maybe deserves a whole book if it hasn't been written. I also think for your run-of-the-mill Catholics, say, the rank and file, many of them don't want to hear this either because they're happy to live materialistic lives and don't, the idea, you got to give your possessions to the poor. What are you talking about? It's not an easy philosophy, So I don't know. There's a lot of reasons why people don't like that. And that was the part I liked the most as a kid. St. Francis represents that. Of course, I hope if Ed Clunan listens to this, he's a guy who was very moved by this to this day.
Yeah.
And it is a shame. I'll just say it's a shame. It's something that was lost. And even Noam Chomsky, he was Jewish, a lot of what he wrote about was trying to reclaim the old Christianity. He was very, very obsessed with that because it is a beautiful philosophy. And I think it's worth preserving. And certainly the Palestinians to this day try to preserve that. And that's, again, why they're a danger, not just to the state of Israel, but to capitalism in general, Right. I'm very moved by the devoutness of the Palestinian people. And it's a strength they have, I think. I mean, I think we'd have to admit that not just in terms of Christianity, but Islam, that the devoutness that the people in Gaza have, their religious devoutness has helped save them. I mean, again, as Marxists, we may not want to discuss that, but when you see these people praying on these wet rugs in the rain because their mosque had been destroyed by Israel, and they're out, it's stunning. And there's something to be learned from it, I think. Anyway, I'm very moved by that.
What's your next trip, Dan?
In 3 weeks, I'm going to Egypt with a legal team, and we're going to interview people from Gaza about what they went through to build testimony for the ICC and ICJ cases.
Good.
That's my next trip to Egypt. And I have some dear friends. I mentioned the student I had. He moved there. He's going to be there, and he's a lawyer. I've invited him to be part of our delegation. So I'm very excited about that trip. That's my next trip.
Well, great. Well, I love this, Dan. This was really a good read. I love George Galloway saying, "New leaders like Dan Kovalik are now among us. New books like this are weapons," and this is a weapon. And
wow. Thank you.
And that's.
Bear in mind, we have election results coming in from the UK after we get off the phone, off the Zoom conference. UK election is today, and we'll see how Galloway did and how Corbyn did and others. Hopefully they did well.
Should be very interesting. Very interesting. Well, I want to thank you for your kind words again. As an author, I can't tell you, it's oxygen. It's absolute oxygen. So thank you. And thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you so much.